Hi, I'm Cathy Smith. I'm a postdoc at Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London, and I'm also part of the Leverhulme Centre for Wildfires, Environment and Society. I'm going to talk today about some work I've been doing together with Mistry to create a database of information from case studies in the literature about the contemporary fire practices of hunter-gatherers and smallholder agriculturalists and pastoralists. So just to give you a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to begin by reviewing something about the kind of status of our knowledge of these contemporary fire practices at the global scale. And I'm going to talk through the methodology we followed to create this database, drawing from many published case studies. And we're going to talk through some preliminary findings from the database, just focusing on a few analyses that we've been doing. And talk about some of the future directions for the research. So over recent decades, there's been many detailed case studies published about hunter-gatherer and smallholder agriculturalist and pastoralist fire practices. And these are spread quite a lot throughout the literature, both in papers or books that focus explicitly on fire use, but also in papers where fire use is kind of a bit more tangential to what the person is actually writing about. But there are very limited existing kind of global scale databases or literature reviews that draw on this literature. And most of the existing ones are quite limited in the number of sources they include, and they've been oriented towards very specific research questions. So none of these reviews has provided a kind of broad base of information that could be drawn on to answer various different questions about the social and biophysical nature of these fire practices for a diversity of research applications. Now, I guess this is problematic because at present human fire practices are quite poorly understood at the global scale. These kind of livelihood oriented practices are not commonly part of public or scientific discourse about fire at the global scale, which generally centres on wildfire risk. So there's a lack of recognition of the importance of fire within subsistence and smallholder livelihoods, and that's continuing in the wake of colonial fire suppression in many places. And there's also evidence that there are co-benefits to many of these livelihood-oriented practices in terms of reducing wildfire risk and in terms of creating more heterogeneous landscapes that are beneficial for biodiversity. So there's a kind of need to put these practices, I guess, on the map and into the global discourse about fire. And then there is also a very poor representation of human fire use in existing global fire models. These models can be quite sophisticated in the way that they represent fire vegetation interactions, but human fire use and suppression are generally included simply as a function of population density. So it's in this context that we've started this work to collate knowledge from various sources, both published and unpublished, about these practices, these fire practices at the global scale, as a basis for varied types of analysis. Another aim of the database is to basically assess the status of our knowledge at the global scale of these practices. So where geographically are there big knowledge gaps, and what types of data do we not have about these practices? So do we know more about their social relevance, for example, than we do about their seasonality? And then another important purpose is to kind of have a basis for putting these practices, these livelihood-oriented practices, on the map, and to have a basis to kind of create a new global discourse around fire, about the importance of human fire use. And finally, an important aim is to determine the potential for this data to inform representation of human fire use in global fire models. So I'm just going to talk through a bit about the methodology we've used to create the database. So we followed a systematic literature review approach, but we also wanted to find, I guess, grey literature, so unpublished reports, theses, and so on. And we also were looking for both papers that were explicitly about fire, but also papers where this was a more tangential question. So we searched a number of different databases. We did a systematic search of the Web of Science core collection. We searched the database of the Fire Research Institute's library, and then worked our way through a number of existing published literature reviews, looking at the all of the papers that have been included there. And then once we had an initial set of sources from those first searches, we also included sources that were referenced in those. So that was a kind of snowball sampling method. So when we were choosing whether or not to include a source in our database, we had a number of criteria. So we only included papers that were published or written after 1995, where data collection took place during or after 1990. We only included sources where there was discussion of original empirical research rather than reviews or papers that drew on secondary data. Of course, we only included papers that talked about hunter-gatherer, smallholder agriculturalist or pastoralist fire practices. And importantly, as they were currently practiced at the time of the study, or practiced within the living memory of research participants. And we only included papers with a subnational scale of analysis. So we, once we had our sources, we had over 590 sources that we've included in the database. We started inputting information from these into Excel. So because we wanted this to be a very bottom-up process of building the database, we initially used mostly free text to record information about the various things we were interested in. And then in a later iteration of the database, we've started to code some of that free text to create categories, and for which we've kind of drawn on the free text to derive the categories. So in the current version of the database, we retain all of the free text, but we've not yet coded all of it. So that could be part of, there could be much more coding that takes place as part of future analyses. So in the database, we have 3 different tabs. The first one records information about the sources themselves, so the year of publication, the research methods, the language of publication. Then we have information about the location where the studies took place. So we have information about fieldwork dates, specific kind of lat-long and description of the location of the study, and as well as kind of recording which country and which WWF ecoregion and biome a study sits within. We have background information about the people who practice the fire practices and their livelihoods, as well as background information about the governance context that structures fire use in some way. And then for each of these case study locations, we have information about a number of practices that take place there, and that includes both fire use practices and fire control practices. So here when deciding what to count as a separate practice, we generally tended to follow the structure that was used by the authors of the paper that we were drawing on. So if, for example, the authors listed a number of purposes for fire use, and that was the way they were distinguishing between different fire practices, then each of those would receive a separate line in the database. If, however, a paper was clear that multiple purposes were associated with the same ignitions on the landscape, for example, and that a key determinant of how fires look is their seasonality, for example, then there might be multiple purposes associated with a practice in the database. So the information we've recorded for each of these practices is about the purpose or purposes, the relationship the practice has to markets, if any, the fire return interval for ignitions on a particular patch, I guess. The timing of fire use for that particular practice, so the months and the seasons in which it takes place, and any kind of social or environmental cues that are drawn upon by those practicing the practice in order to know when to use or control fire. The information about participation, so are particular genders or group sizes involved, for example. Information about how fire is actually physically applied to the landscape. Information about ways in which fire is controlled. So that could be in association with fire use, or it could be separate from fire use. information about the area burned per ignition, how fire knowledge is learned and transmitted, information about community level fire governance, information about whether a practice has been mobilized for state or non-governmental agendas, and also information about changes to the practice. And we've tried to record whether there's a increasing or decreasing trend in terms of the proportion of the population participating, the proportion of the landscape that burns annually, and the fire return interval in a given patch of the landscape. So just a little bit more background about the sources we've included in the database. We found that 67% of the papers used interview as a research method and 38% used ethnography, although 74% of sources used mixed methods. We also found that most of the sources were published in English, 92%, and that's largely because most of the databases that we searched, including, for example, Web of Science, mostly include sources in English. Most of the sources we found in other languages, mostly Portuguese, Spanish, and French, we found through the snowball sampling that we did. So here you can see a map of all the case study locations in the database. So as I said, this drew from 592 sources, and we have 587 different case study locations. And now it's possible to have less case study locations than sources, because we grouped together sources that spoke to the same location and were written by the same authors into a single kind of unit, and drew information from all of them together to report on the cases and the practices associated with them. And there were also, of course, sources that reported on multiple case study locations. So you can see that there is a concentration of cases in the global south, and particularly in the tropics. The number of cases, the high number of cases in the USA and Australia, is not really indicative of kind of widespread fire use as practiced today, but probably reflects more that there's been a lot of studies in these particular locations, and a lot of interest in reviving some of these cultural practices. There are very limited studies by comparison, for example, in Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. So you can see on the left in that table there, the top 8 countries by the number of cases. So really backing up what we saw there on the map, we see that there are far more case study locations in tropical and subtropical biomes than there are in temperate biomes. And we also see a particularly high number of cases in tropical and subtropical moist broadleaf forests, which is linked to a particularly high number of cases in the database that focus on Swidden agriculture. Now, just to give you an indication, out of all of those things that I told you we recorded about fire practices, how complete our data is, we actually only have a mean of 67% of columns complete for a given practice in the database. So most papers will not record information about all those things that I mentioned earlier that we were trying to record. And in particular, we have the least data for the more quantitative things, such as the area burned per ignition and the fire return interval. And we also have very little information about participation in fire use and control. In the database, we've classified practices into 4 main types. So we have practices that are just control practices. Those are associated with preventing wildfires generally. We have practices that are fire use practices, where we don't have any information about how fire is controlled specifically. We have practices that are fire use practices, where we also have information about control practices that are directly associated with that fire use. For example, the creation of fire breaks to prevent fire escape from a Swidden agricultural plot. And finally, we have a small number of practices that are opportunistic fire use, we've called it, which is where somebody is making use of a burned area that's created by wildfire or by other people starting fires. So because I've got limited time today, going forward, I'm just going to focus on the fire use practices in the database. I'm going to talk you through briefly a typology we've created that of different purposes for fire use. that we see in the database, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between those purposes for fire use and the spatiotemporal nature of fires. And I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about what we know about the status of fire use in terms of whether it's increasing or decreasing in association with these different purposes. So as I said, when we first started creating the database, we described most things using free text, including the purposes for fire use, but we've since worked with what we wrote in those initial free text cells to develop a typology of different purposes for fire use. And these sit under 8 kind of higher level categories, and there are 29 lower level categories associated with those. So our higher level categories are agriculture, pastoralism, hunting and fishing, gathering, charcoal and firewood production, movement, so things associated with access to the landscape, promoting human health and well-being, and social signals. And we find that 17% of practices in the database have more than one of these second tier purposes associated with them. Though in reality, I think this is probably higher. I think it's common that fire use is associated with multiple of these purposes, particularly when we consider that there can be short-term and long-term benefits associated with the same fire use practice. But it's not always recorded in a paper which purposes relate to the same ignitions. So in that case, we'd have listed them as separate practices. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the seasonality of fire use associated with these different purposes. And I'm only including here the data for those purposes with more than 12 data points, because the others we can't really say anything too reliably from that data. So along the x-axis of these graphs, we have a number of seasons listed, which I'll just explain. We have AL, which is all year round. We have ED, which is early dry season, LD, which is late dry season, TW, transitional to wet season, LW, late wet season, TD, transitional to dry season. And then for case studies that are in the northern or in the far northern and southern hemispheres, we have SP, spring, SU, summer, AU, autumn, WI, winter. So there are a number of patterns we can see in the data. So we see that fires associated with fire prevention or control, so fires that are set to reduce fuel loads in the landscape or to create fire breaks, tend to be set most frequently in the early dry season. We see that fires associated with gathering tend to take place throughout the dry season, so most frequently in the early and late dry seasons. And then in the far northern and far southern hemispheres, we see gathering fires in the spring and autumn particularly. And then we have a number of purposes for which fires are set in the more commonly in the early dry season, but fairly frequently throughout the dry season. So those are fires associated with creating forage for hunting. We see fires associated with reducing dangerous animals in the landscape and maintaining trails and waterways. And then another set of practices, other hunting fires and pastoral fires in particular, that seem to have a slightly stronger association with the late dry season, but again are set throughout the dry season in many places. And then we have fires that are for agriculture, which are very strongly associated with the late dry season across various different agricultural fires. So this next slide gives you some data about fire return interval associated with different fire purposes. Here I'm only including data for those purposes where we have more than 5 data points. Now we see the longest timescales on which fire is returning to the landscape, and the biggest range of values for Swidden fires, ranging from less than 5 years to more than 25 years. We see the shortest timescales by contrast with approximately 1 year fire return intervals for crop residue burning, the construction of fire breaks, and ceremonial fires. Other fire types, so across pastoral, hunting and fishing and gathering, access to the landscape, etc., we tend to see those on sub 5 year timescales. And here we've got some data for the area burned per ignition, again associated with different purposes for fire use. Again, I'm only including those for which we have more than 5 data points. So we have far less data on this than we did for fire return interval, and no data here for any type of hunting fires. So we see here that all agricultural fire purposes are associated with much smaller burned areas, so generally smaller than 2 hectares, than gathering, pastoral or fuel reduction fires, which are far larger and also far more variable in size, ranging from under 10 hectares up to more than 100 hectares. I've excluded some outliers on this graph, which are over 100 hectares. The final snippet of preliminary analysis from the database is around the status of these different practices. So we looked at the trend in terms of the proportion of the population practicing the practice, the proportion of the landscape in the region burned per year, and the frequency of fire in a given patch of the landscape. And we looked across all these different purposes for fire use, whether there was a kind of significant increase or decrease recorded across the different case studies. And we ran a binomial test to look at the significance of that increase or decrease. So in this table, you can see those purposes for which we had an insignificant result in white, those purposes for which we saw a decrease in red, and those for which we saw an increase in blue. The insignificant results are probably most commonly associated with a lack of data than they are with a lack of trend necessarily. So what we see here is that market-oriented practices, all market-oriented practices, are more likely to be increasing, whereas subsistence-oriented practices across the board are more likely to be decreasing. And then among the particular purposes for fire use, we see that it's only really permanent agriculture and arson that are more likely to be increasing, and most other practices seem to be decreasing in most places. The one kind of exception to that is that we see an increasing frequency of swidden fires in many places in a given patch of the landscape where they take place, and that is linked to declining fallow periods. So a common pattern is to see a reduction in the area over which swidden is taking place, but an increase in the frequency with which fire is being used for swidden agriculture in those places. In the database, we have recorded more information about changes to the practices in a free text cell. So I'm hoping that one of the future analyses we can do will be to look at some of the drivers of these trends that we're reporting on here. So in terms of next steps for myself and my colleague Jay, we're hoping to get the database up online soon, so it's freely available to other researchers. So please pop me an email if you'd like me to let you know when it does go live, and I can send you a link. We're also hoping to publish some first analyses related to the status of fire use practices and the spatio-temporal signature of fires set for different purposes. So the analyses I've presented today. As well as developing different analyses, looking, for example, as I said, at the drivers of change in fire use and at governance of fire use, something I've not talked about at all today. So I'll just flash this slide up briefly in case anyone is interested in the references for any of the other literature reviews or databases that we drew literature from. That's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm really happy to answer any questions in the chat or to chat with you afterwards. Thank you.